I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear
I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
that I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States
the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
It was a rare and defining moment, unlike any before or since. It painted a revealing portrait of the man who had met his appointment with history. That the race does not always go to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. That bread does not always go to the wise, nor wealth to men of understanding, or favor to men of skill. But time and chance happens to them all. It was no accident that led Gerald Ford to this place at this time. A series of events that had brought the nation to the edge of the most serious constitutional crisis in a century was never fully understood by most Americans or the world. At a time when the country was suffering from the trauma of Watergate, it was Gerald Ford who took the nation from crisis to stability.
I would remember him as a leader, first and foremost. He was the right man for this country at the right time in the most extraordinary crisis of the constitutional system since the Civil War.
But I think he saved the country. In fact, he saved it in such a matter-of-fact way that he isn't given any credit for it.
Well, he was I think a national treasure.
I don't think he did change the White House. I think, if anything, he changed the country while he was in the White House. He restored the honesty, the truthfulness, the integrity of the office of the President of the United States.
I love him like a brother. I'll think of him often. I will think of what he did for me, my town, my family, my country. He was all things to all people.
When Gerald Ford came home to Grand Rapids to celebrate his 90th birthday, he was greeted by 15,000 well-wishers who embraced him as their former president and their favorite son. It said a lot about the community that had supported Ford for nearly 60 years. He was simply overwhelmed.
There is something important about the character of the people of Western Michigan and Grand Rapids. And Betty and I, we hope, represent that character that's important to a community, to a marriage, and to your day-to-day living.
That celebration, those 15,000 people, so many young children, was a marvelous example of the decency that Jerry Ford brings us and represents for us as us. So we'll never forget him.
To know Gerald Ford, you must know the city where he grew up and the district that he represented in Congress for a quarter century. One of Ford's admirers in the crowd that July day was Jerry DiTrapani, who had known the president for over 50 years. DiTrapani's shop on Fulton Street was one of many unofficial Ford for Congress headquarters in 1948. Jerry DiTrapani was Gerald Ford's barber.
Here was a man that was a president of the United States, probably one of the most important people in the whole world, and yet he was just a common, ordinary, down-to-earth, likable fellow. You just could not help but like this man.
Down-to-earth and likable describes the city where Gerald Ford grew up. Grand Rapids had deep Calvinist roots. Over 30% of the people here were of conservative Dutch ancestry. Half the population was Catholic, with close-knit neighborhoods of European immigrants. The city was known for two things: the manufacture of fine furniture and a persistent faith in the Almighty. Historians wrote that cleanliness, godliness, and thrift comprised Grand Rapids' Holy Trinity. It was a good place to grow up and grow old.
This was a city that has always been known for self-reliance. You solve your own problems and you don't appeal to someone else for help. It had the second best public education system in the country. It had a home ownership of well over 50%, which was most unusual in the 20s. It was a place which had a combination of the Dutch thrift and enterprise and cleanliness and candor in dealing in business. This was a working man's city and an entrepreneur city.
Gerald Ford was not born a Ford. He was born a king, Leslie Lynch King, Jr., in Omaha, Nebraska in 1913. His father was a wool merchant from Wyoming, a ruthless, abusive husband who tormented Ford's young mother, the genteel Dorothy Gardner.
A few days after the birth of the child, when she was having some difficulty recovering, he came in with a butcher knife and threatened to kill them both. And she called a lawyer and said, what should I do? And he said, you should get out of there as fast as you can.
I knew that my dad's real biological name was, Leslie Lynch King, Jr. I knew that he was from Omaha and that sort of thing. It was not discussed. That person didn't have an effect on his life. My grandfather was Grandpa Ford. I mean, that was the grandfather that I knew.
The grandfather Susan Ford knew was Gerald Ford Sr., a Grand Rapids paint and varnish salesman. For Dorothy King, he was everything her first husband was not: disciplined, gentle, self-confident, a man of his word, and respectful of a lady. Core values the future president would learn growing up in Grand Rapids.
And Grandpa Ford was Grandpa Ford, and my dad looked like him. That's, to me, I mean, look at the hairline that they both had. The amazing thing was how much they looked alike.
My mother and my stepfather were truly a great inspiration to me as I grew up. They had high standards of conduct for themselves, and they expected me and my three brothers to have the same.
I will always remember an event that occurred here in Grand Rapids on the election day of 1976. We came in the night before, as was traditional on election day, spent the night here in Grand Rapids, got up the next morning, he went and voted. Then he always had breakfast at the same restaurant with a group of friends. And then we got in the cars and went out to the airport. And on our way out of town, we dedicated the mural. There's a big mural on the wall out there of President Ford and his family. And on the wall are paintings of his mother and his father. And it was one of the most emotional moments I ever experienced with the president. For him, he got very emotional about it. The staff all did, the press did. Helen Thomas was crying. I mean, it was one of these events that just captured sort of the essence of who Jerry Ford was and where he was from, and how much his character and his life had been shaped by these people who were so important in it, his mother and his stepfather.
Gerald Ford's boyhood was the stuff of legend and legacy. I was as happy a young man as you could find, he said. I was lucky. The story seems ordinary, like the boy next door. But for the man who would become President of the United States, it is also extraordinary. Ford was a model Eagle Scout who lived the Ford family values. tell the truth, work hard, and come to dinner on time. Ford was a mentor to his 3 half-brothers and a hero to his mother. He was the son his natural father only met twice in his life, but the son his stepfather loved all his life.
The father treated Ford as though he were his own child. The father was kind, gentle, thoughtful, honest, and very caring for this young boy that he had taken to train as his own.
Dorothy Ford's guiding influence on her son balanced the temperamental blood he had inherited from Leslie King. She often sent young Ford to his room to control a raging temper.
At other times, she would make him recite Rudyard Kipling's poem, If, and this taught him to control his temper fairly well.
It was almost as if Kipling had written the poem with Gerald Ford in mind. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the earth and everything that's in it, and which is more, you'll be a man, my son. Ford was an all-state athlete at Grand Rapids South High School. He was a scholar and a football star at the University of Michigan, who believed that you should win if you can. If you lose, try again.
He was very good. He was very successful at the University of Michigan, so successful that he got offers from the Detroit Lions and Green Bay Packers to play in the NFL.
He's probably the greatest athlete that ever sat in the White House. He's a terrific football player, captain of his team.
It taught him several things. One, you do your part. You play your assigned role. Second, you're part of a team. And third, the player who does most for the team is not necessarily the one who gets the most public attention.
At Yale Law School, Jerry Ford was a rising star. He paid for his tuition by coaching football and boxing, and worked summers as a park ranger in California. At Yale, Ford was someone to watch. As a young Grand Rapids attorney, he was someone worth watching and worth trusting.
It's been said that Grand Rapids is a place a man can journey afar and never leave. And that's exactly what happened in President Ford's lifetime. Many journeys, but he never really left Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids was home, and he belonged here. And he was very, very comfortable being in Grand Rapids. And it would become the stepping stone for more journeys.
Ford's young Grand Rapids law practice was interrupted by World War II. As a Navy ensign in the South Pacific, Ford learned that international borders reached far beyond provincial Grand Rapids, and that the United States was not an isolated country divinely placed between 2 oceans to avoid foreign confrontations. After the war, Ford returned home a changed man with a broad view of the world.
Much of the Midwest was isolationist before the war, and indeed during the war. Gerald Ford came back, or Commander Ford came back from the war and resolved to go into public life, and indeed challenged a congressman who was a very conservative isolationist, Congressman Jonkman, I believe was pronounced, challenged him in a primary and beat him in a primary.
Winning a seat in Congress wasn't Gerald Ford's only victory that year. He also won the heart and the hand of Betty Bloomer Warren. They kept their engagement a secret until after the election, fearing that Betty's status as a Grand Rapids divorcee and a dancer would influence Grand Rapids church-going conservatives. Their mutual love and loyalty would sustain them through 13 congressional campaigns, all the way to the White House and beyond, through good times and bad.
I have not campaigned either for the presidency or the vice presidency. I have not subscribed to any partisan platform. I am indebted to no man, and only to one woman, my dear wife.
I have terrific admiration for Betty Ford. I think she's a stand-up woman. I mean, she'll tell you, she is so honest. We could always ask her a question and get a straight answer, much to our astonishment.
In our family, if you picked a fight, you fought your fight. And you have every right to speak out and have an opinion. Whether it's right or wrong, you have a right to your opinion. And so we were raised to speak out.
Other first ladies feel they have to be more protective, but she always believed in the truth. And I think that I admire her husband so much because he permitted her to be a real person and to excel. Her honesty was magnificent.
An early photo from the Ford family album was anything but prophetic. He rode a donkey. 30 years later, he would ride an elephant as a rising star in the grand old party.
Jerry Ford loved the house. He considered himself a man of the house.
Gerald Ford never had public relations in what we think of it in that sense. He was what you saw. The man you saw is exactly the man he was.
The point is, this man could not help but be honest and forthright and tell it straight, and he said what he thought, and it was wonderful, it was charming.
Truth is the glue or the bond that holds government together. And not only government, but civilization itself.
He didn't play games. He was renowned for saying it the way it was, although perhaps not in the most eloquent manner.
Ford's 25 years in Congress helped lay the groundwork for his eventual appointment with history. Jerry and Betty Ford lived in the same unpretentious house in Arlington for nearly all of his years in Congress. He was a quick study in Washington. Ford was well liked. He had opponents, but no enemies. Ford practiced the political art of intelligent compromise, with low-key Midwestern habits of fairness, civility, and truth-telling. Ford was a restless but careful maverick. In 1965, he engineered the overthrow of House Minority Leader and fellow Republican Charlie Halleck and captured the top leadership position for himself. Ford was a loyalist, but he was also an insurgent.
On the surface, I had a reputation of being a regular within the party. The truth was I was sort of a rebel.
He knew where the bodies were buried, and he knew how everyone played the game, and he knew every man's price on Capitol Hill. In that way, he was like LBJ in the sense he knew politics, he knew how far they could compromise, and yet he was very much a party man.
Ford was not a guy who engaged in backbiting and petty politics, and even though he had been a revolutionary in the House, and they successfully moved Charlie Halleck aside and all that kind of stuff. So he was no naif, but in the main, and in comparison with what goes on in Washington nowadays, he was about as straight and narrow as you can imagine.
You know, when Jerry Ford was in Congress, the salary was only $36,000 a year. They didn't have any money in the bank. He had to stay in inexpensive hotels when he traveled. He had to keep a home here and a home there without the expense support that they might have today. So theirs was not an easy life, 26 years of that.
Ford understood the value of paying his dues in Washington and the sacrifice it required. Ford's stepfather had taught him that hard work brings good luck. In the end, Ford simply outworked everyone on the Hill. Responsibilities in Congress and back home in Michigan's 5th District left little time for his family.
I think it had an adverse effect on Betty Ford because she carried this burden, and it was a terrible burden. At one point, she woke up in the night, and he'd just gotten back from a trip and was trying to get into bed without waking her. And she kind of looked up and said, "What are you doing here?"
He was used to being where the pressure was, and then it was just by nature. He was somebody who you looked to when things got tough, because he was the one who kept his head when all around you were those who didn't.
Ford aspired to only one higher office, a job that, to him, had more interest and influence than even the White House.
He always told me he aspired primarily to be Speaker of the House of Representatives.
But with a firm Democratic majority in Congress, Ford's dream of Speaker never happened. Ironically, time and chance intervened.
Our distinguished guests and my fellow Americans, I proudly present to you the man whose name I will submit to the Congress of the United States for confirmation as the Vice President of the United States, Congressman Gerald Ford of Michigan.
With the sudden resignation of Vice President Spiro Agnew, who had been caught in a bribery scandal in Maryland, Ford found himself thrust into a position that not even his friend Richard Nixon fully endorsed.
Jerry Ford was not Nixon's first choice as vice president. His first choice was John Connally, and he proposed to send him up to the House and Senate for confirmation.
But Connally, a former Democrat turned Republican, was unacceptable to congressional dealmakers.
The Democrats thought him an ingrate and a traitor to the party, and the Republicans thought he was an opportunist, so neither side was going to confirm him as vice president. He was anathema on the Hill. So the question was who would be chosen. Nixon, in a letter to me, said he had three choices. One was Jerry Ford, who was his close friend. The other was Ronald Reagan, and the third was Nelson Rockefeller.
Nixon felt Reagan was too conservative, and New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller too liberal. The Speaker of the House and Senate Majority Leader suggested Jerry Ford, and for a very good reason.
They chose Ford and recommended Ford to Nixon because they felt sure that Nixon was going to be thrown out of office and that Ford would be the next president. Carl Albert said to me, "We chose the next president."
The fallout from Watergate had begun to reach critical mass long before Ford's confirmation hearings began. The scandal was threatening Richard Nixon's presidency. The unfolding Watergate drama was deeply troubling to congressional leaders and ordinary citizens alike. It divided friends and families. It polarized political order. It aroused passions of reprisal and revenge. In the midst of it all, Gerald Ford remained detached, blinded by political and personal loyalty, denial, and disbelief.
Not for a moment did Ford believe that that Nixon had done anything wrong. Nixon was his friend, Nixon was a leader, and he felt that Nixon had done nothing wrong. In this Watergate business, there was nothing to it.
I think there was a feeling in Washington that Nixon's days were numbered and that Ford was going to be the next president, which is always one of the ironies of Watergate, because I always had been told as a young White House reporter that Nixon viewed Ford as impeachment insurance, that because Jerry Ford had this reputation as not being very bright and not being presidential material, that nobody would want to get rid of Nixon if the alternative was Gerald Ford. And I think it was one of many of Richard Nixon's miscalculations.
Mr. Chairman,
the road to Ford's vice presidency was paved with political intrigue. New York Congresswoman Bella Abzug led a group of a dozen progressive Democrats in an attempt to circumvent the 25th Amendment and put House Speaker Carl Albert in the White House. It was as close to a coup d'etat as America had ever come.
Bella Abzug went to Speaker Albert and said, "Why don't we take this over? We can win this. We can make you president. We can block the confirmation of Ford, We can force Nixon out of office, and then we'll seize the White House. And this was a serious attempt by a handful of Democratic activists in the House. Carl Albert said absolutely not. He refused to do that and said, we're going to get this confirmed. We're going to get Ford confirmed as quickly as we can.
Gerald Ford became the most thoroughly investigated politician in American history. Democrats and Republicans alike, who knew and admired Ford, were unrelenting in their probe, leaving no stone unturned and no skeleton unexamined. What they found was an Eagle Scout from Grand Rapids.
He's an Eagle Scout, and he lived by being an Eagle Scout.
Ford's prepared remarks set the tone for the hearings.
But I believe and I hope that I have been honest with myself and with others, that I have been faithful to my friends and fair to my opponents, and that I have tried my very best to make this great government work for the good of all Americans.
In December of 1973, Ford was confirmed by a congressional landslide as America's first unelected vice president.
Once he became vice president, Ford decided that it would be best for him to stay out of Washington. Number one, he didn't want to be involved in Watergate in any way.
He tried really hard to balance his own personal misgivings about some of the things that were going on at the White House with a sense of needing to be loyal to his president and to try to do whatever he could to hold the country together in a very difficult time. And it was very tough. And one of the things that I really admired about his performance in those days was that wherever he went, he always had a press conference. And the questions were much more loaded than the questions a president or a vice president would get today. They were, should Richard Nixon resign? What about Agnew? What about the stonewalling? Should President Nixon turn over the tapes to the House impeachment inquiry? All loaded questions, legitimate questions, and loaded questions. And Ford could have easily ducked them all by not having press conferences, but he always had press conferences. And I think it was just part of his fundamental makeup that he thought that senior officials of the government should be accountable to the people, at least through the press occasionally.
He was very popular with reporters, even those who occasionally wrote critical things about him. And I think that's again indicative of his personality. The press loved him. You know, he was approachable. He never carried a grudge. He was very loyal to his friends.
The press, I think, underestimated his inner strength and resolve and was kind of looking for, I don't know, somebody more exciting or intellectual perhaps, and Ford was meat and potatoes.
Ford's vice presidency was short-lived. It lasted just 8 turbulent months. Watergate had conflicted and consumed Washington and the nation. Early in 1974, Nixon considered resigning from office, but decided to stay and fight. Calls for impeachment gained political momentum. Ford, more and more, became convinced that Nixon's resignation would be in the best interest of the country, and he struggled with coloring the shades of truth in defense of the president.
The last months of the Nixon administration were a nightmare. You knew some sort of catastrophe was all around you, but you didn't know what.
What Ford gave was balance and good sense to decisions, you know. And I think that was his great contribution.
The country wanted to get rid of the whole taint of Nixon, and unfortunately Ford, bore some of the taint just by association.
Al Haig, who was chief of staff to Nixon, came over to see him and suggested that that the president had not decided what he was going to do, but they were considering 6 options. And one of the options, the 6th option, was that Nixon might resign and Ford would pardon him. So he went home that night and talked to Betty, and she was very concerned about it. He talked the next day to Jack Marsh, his counselor, his other counselor, and his colleague from the House of Representatives. And Jack Marsh said, "Bob's right, Mr. Vice President, you can't do this." So, but still Ford was not convinced. Well, what is the best thing for the country? And so they called in Bryce Harlow, who had been an advisor to presidents since Eisenhower. And Bryce Harlow listened to what the proposal had been and said, "You cannot do this, Mr. Vice President. This would taint your presidency. You're going to be president anyway. Nixon's going to be forced to resign or impeached. So you have to be clear of this. So call him up and tell him no."
Well into Ford's presidency and beyond, speculation persisted that he had struck a deal with Haig and Nixon. Haig would later deny that he had anything to do with the Nixon pardon.
The Watergate spirit, at least in the media and among a lot of Democrats, carried on into the Ford administration, and there was a lot of suspicion that that he'd somehow, you know, been paid off with the presidency in return for the pardon and all that kind of stuff, which I think he successfully and honestly put to rest.
I believe that Al Haig, for the good of the country, helped Nixon decide to resign rather than go through the ordeal, not only for himself, the ordeal for the nation of impeachment. And we must give Al credit for helping Nixon make up his mind.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
The resignation of President Nixon came as no surprise to Gerald Ford. It had been a matter of time and chance. Now, the burden was his. In his final hours as president, Richard Nixon was philosophical. So was Gerald Ford.
Because the greatness comes not when things go always good for you, but the greatness comes and you're really tested when you take some knocks, some disappointments, when sadness comes. Because only if you've been in the deepest valley can you ever know how magnificent it is to be on the highest mountain.
Gerald Ford did not wear his religion on his sleeve, but he had an abiding faith that would direct a kind of spiritual journey that began in Grand Rapids 60 years earlier. Gerald Ford's acceptance speech, that our long national nightmare was over, struck a healing, almost religious tone.
As we bind up the internal wounds of Watergate, more painful and more poisonous than those of foreign wars, let us restore the golden rule to our political process, and let brotherly love purge our hearts of suspicion and of hate. May our former president, who brought peace to millions, find it for himself.
President Ford came to the Oval Office with a reservoir of respect, and I think the characteristic that helped him most was his blatant, his open honesty and integrity.
And the remarkable thing about Ford was he was absolutely calm. He was not nervous. He didn't say, "This has fallen on me, what am I going to do?" He had a chance to serve his country. He didn't brag, he didn't boast. He knew what he could do. He knew what he needed help on. He had no complexes. And from the first moment, it was a joy to work with him.
Within hours of Nixon's resignation, the new president was at work in the White House. With the orderly transfer of power, Washington and the nation took a deep breath. So did Gerald Ford.
When he first came in, we all heaved a sigh of relief. He was so on target when he said the long national nightmare was over, and that was so well put.
And that was a great gift to the country, not to have the country wallowing in Watergate for another interminable time, and I think he deserves a great deal of credit for it.
In what I've always viewed as probably the most serious constitutional crisis we've had since the Civil War, he was there when it ended to sort of bind up the nation's wounds, to restore people's confidence in government. And simply by the sheer force of his character and his personal qualities, restore trust and confidence, if you will, in the presidency and the White House. That was his, I think, his single biggest contribution.
My fellow Americans, we have a lot of work to do. My former colleagues, you and I have a lot of work to do. Let's get on with it.
Getting on with it would not be easy. The fallout from Watergate and the wake of Richard Nixon exhausted Ford's young presidency.
The thing I always will remember about Gerald Ford is his grace under pressure. It was a grave moment, and in the midst of all of this came this pipe-smoking, simple, ordinary guy from Grand Rapids who managed in his understated way to calm the country down and, upon becoming president, to heal the nation.
10 days after taking office, Ford traveled to Chicago, where he stunned the veterans of foreign wars and party conservatives by announcing a limited amnesty program for Vietnam War draft dodgers.
Unlike my last two predecessors, I did not enter this office facing the terrible decisions of a foreign war. But like President Truman and President Lincoln before him, I found on my desk, where the buck stops, the urgent problem of how to bind up the nation's wounds. And I intend to do that.
The heart of Ford's speech touched familiar spiritual chords: justice, mercy, compassion, and forgiveness. It may have been an omen to how he would pursue the legalities of a fallen president and the needs of a rising nation. Ford aggressively engaged domestic and foreign policy on a grand scale. The war in Vietnam, conflict in the Middle East, a serious economic recession. He formed an administration comprised of still familiar names and faces: Bush, Rumsfeld, Cheney, Greenspan, Kissinger, and to the chagrin of party conservatives, Ford chose Nelson Rockefeller as his vice president. But despite his best intentions, there was the shadow of Richard Nixon. It hung around Gerald Ford's neck like an albatross. At his first news conference, most of the questions were about the ex-president. Would Ford pardon Nixon?
I think I had one of the first questions, and I asked him whether he was going to pardon, basically, or follow the judicial process.
Well, he gave at least three different conflicting answers. President Ford gave at least three different conflicting answers. And when he got off the podium, he knew he'd done a lousy job.
Ford's botched news conference, driven by the shadow of Watergate, convinced him to put an end to the scandal once and for all.
Granting of the pardon was predicated on what was in the national interest, to get rid of the Watergate mess and to start concentrating on the problems of the day, the economy, the war in Vietnam, etc.
Ford's decision was a well-kept secret. Philip Buchan, Ford's White House counsel and former law partner, was asked to discreetly research the legal precedent for pardons. Perplexed by the ethics of Ford's request, Buchan sought guidance from his friend Duncan Littlefair and asked him to secretly come to Washington. Littlefair was Buchan's minister at Grand Rapids Fountain Street Church.
Ford was concerned about it. Wrestling was, as I said, with a problem like you or I would. That decision came from him, and it was of worldwide importance. And he was a simple religious person. He knew when he heard it that forgiveness was utterly essential to being a decent human being. I don't think many presidents have made a more courageous decision on a better religious moral ground than he did.
Ford's surprise announcement granting Nixon a full, free, and absolute pardon shocked the nation.
I do believe with all my heart and mind and spirit that I, not as president, but as a humble servant of God, will receive justice without mercy if I fail to show mercy.
Ford's pardon of Nixon was blasted as the greatest plea bargain in history. It caused a firestorm of outrage. Duncan Littlefair supported Ford's decision and raised more than a few eyebrows back in Grand Rapids. He put the pardon in a national religious context that reverberated all the way to Washington.
The pardon was a symbolic act of mercy and should be seen as an expression of our desire to be forgiving. I advocated that we forgive them all. What a mockery of our religion if we cannot.
Ford got rid of the issue at high cost to himself, but it was the right thing to do. And what we will miss about Ford is a president whose first consideration is what is best for the country.
He was right on the pardon, and it may well have cost him the presidency.
I think he was shocked, as I was, at the dramatic drop in support.
And I remember those words very clear, because he said, it probably will cost me the '76 election.
The thing that to some extent compensated for that was many years later to be given the award for political courage by the Kennedy Library, based upon that act and the way he'd handled it. I know that had great significance for him.
I was one of those who spoke out against his actions then. But time has a way of clarifying past events. And now we see that President Ford was right. His courage and dedication to our country made it possible for us to begin the process of healing and put the tragedy of Watergate behind us.
Gerald Ford was president for 895 days. The full measure of his record is still obscured by the Nixon pardon. He took the country through and out of one of the worst recessions since the Great Depression. Ford moved the U.S. economy back to growth and prosperity, and he brought closure to America's involvement in Vietnam.
One of President Ford's greatest moments is when he participated in the negotiation and the signing of the final act in Helsinki, against the wishes and against the advice of a number of people, but he did it. It was a bold, brave, visionary act that I think contributed greatly to the subsequent demise of the Soviet Union, not by armies marching over it, but by the corrosive power of democracy, market economic activity, and the will of free people.
Ford's foreign policy initiatives were progressive and personable.
He established what I believe was the closest relationship of any American president in any post-war period, and probably in any period, with the European leaders. And he did it by his special qualities: openness, intelligence, directness, and what's even more remarkable is that they have remained friends of his after he left government. He was not dramatic, so he did a lot of these things unobtrusively. But abroad, his reputation was enormous.
Gerald Ford's White House will also be remembered for its candor. America was smiling again. Ford brought a transformation to the presidency based on humility, honesty, and yes, humor, intended or otherwise, even on the golf course.
The only joke I can ever remember that he told in his speeches was how he was playing with Bob Hope, and Bob Hope got a birdie, and on the next hole he was up with his wild drives, and he got an elk and an elephant, or something like that. I mean,
Gerald Ford's strength was never more tested or more apparent than during his wife's battle with breast cancer and substance abuse. Her struggles galvanized America and brought a new self-awareness to women and men around the world. Betty Ford became one of the most influential first ladies since Eleanor Roosevelt.
I think she was and is just such a tremendous asset. Her honesty and her courage in acknowledging weaknesses that every human being on the planet has in one way or another, to one degree or another, I think gave so many people a sense of comfort.
I would say my mother probably saved hundreds of thousands of lives between her breast cancer and substance abuse, because it's not only the fact that it's women who went undiagnosed, but women who now talk about it, but husbands who talk about it, significant others that talk about it. So she's changed a lot of things. She's made a big difference in a lot of lives.
Ford's presidency was anything but passive. He survived 2 assassination attempts.
He was extremely fortunate on the first one. I was about 10 yards behind him when it happened in Sacramento, and fortunately a Secret Service agent, Larry Boondorf, saw what was happening, saw that gun come up, this squeaky prom, reached down and pulled up this .45 automatic. And she was this far from the president, and if Boondorf hadn't hit that gun, it would have blown a hole in Ford big enough, this big around, at that range of .45 automatic. So his life was saved by Larry Boondorf, no question in my mind about that. I saw it.
Gerald Ford had never lost an election until 1976, when he sought a full term as an elected president.
We had a long, hard-fought contest with then Governor Reagan, which we won. Last time Ronald Reagan lost anything, I think.
And with the GOP nomination in hand, Ford replaced Rockefeller with Senator Robert Dole of Kansas and gave the best speech of his political life.
I'm ready, I'm eager to go before the American people and debate the real issues face to face with Jimmy Carter.
President Ford healed this nation to a great degree. And had he not had to assume some of the inherited responsibilities left over from the Nixon administration, I think he would have been invulnerable to any sort of challenge from me or within the Republican Party.
I signed up, my best friend signed up. We went door to door for President Ford, dropping literature, but it was the first political campaign that I had ever worked on. Eventually I ended up switching parties, but I often joke that if I had to support a Republican, he was the one.
The pardon really, I think, made it almost impossible for him to get reelected.
It was too fresh in people's minds. I think when they went to pull the lever, they were not quite sure why he did it, even though he explained as much as he could. So I think that it hurt him.
And I really felt that if there was a man who had earned the right to govern for another 4 years based on his performance, that Gerry Ford was that man. But unfortunately, it wasn't to be. We came up just a few votes short.
I felt I had a much bigger stake in it. It also was the first election I ever voted in. So it was extremely important to me. It was just really disappointing, and you could tell he was disappointed.
Jimmy Carter was ultimately proved to be a failed president, both on economic terms and on foreign policy terms, which probably would not have happened had Gerald Ford been reelected.
I think part of the mystique of Gerry Ford is the fact that he did lose. And there's a little bit of a remorse there that lets the people here say he was our guy, and we lost, so we lost with him. And then there was that basic goodness and decency that we all want to be close to and catch.
Gerald Ford represented the best of American politics, the best kind of values of American politics, and an era that I'm afraid we're never going to see again.
I think clearly the lesson of civility is the greatest lesson that I have taken from President Ford's presidency.
President Bush promised that he would try to restore, civility to American politics. He has not succeeded, but Gerald Ford represented civility in American politics, and I wish we could have it again.
I hope that all of you will reject those on both extremes who mistake the honest clash of ideas for a holy war.
I think there's a craving in our country for honor and integrity and decency, and Gerald Ford just exudes these qualities.
One thing that popped into my head a couple of years ago was an incident that got no attention on the evening news. It was during the primaries of 1976, and he was in Florida. He was on a bus tour of Florida, and he was making some remarks at a shopping mall in Boca Raton, Florida. And he got caught out in a downpour, and he got totally drenched. And his hair was slicked down. It looked like his hair looked like the top of an aircraft carrier. He just got caught out in the rain, and he in 2 minutes, I think, just had a couple of quick remarks, and it said a lot about who he was. I can remember him saying, "I want to apologize for my appearance." He says, "But there's an old saying, aristocracy is of the soul, not of the cloth." And so I don't look like a very good president right now, but I think I'm a darn good president. And I just thought, in a small way, it kind of captured the humility of the man and the essence of who he was. And it's always been one of my favorite anecdotes. And I've finally found the document in the weekly compilation of presidential documents and put it on my bulletin board. And when my 7-year-old is a little older, I'm going to read it to him, because I think it was a nice little summation of Gerald Ford, the man.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
That I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
The office.
On January 20th, 1977, Jimmy Carter was sworn in as America's 39th president. For Gerald Ford, there was victory even in defeat.
But one of the best things that President Carter did was, at his inaugural, say a word of thanks to President Ford for what he had done to heal the country.
For myself and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he has done to heal our land.
Gerald Ford's 90th birthday brought a celebrated life full circle, back to where it all began. Much of the audience was too young to remember Watergate or Vietnam or Ford's time to heal. People just wanted to be near him, and he wanted to be near them. Grand Rapids was grateful, and so was Gerald Ford.
I thank you from the very bottom of my heart. Thank you very, very much.
I don't ever want to lose him. And I'm glad my girls are in their 20s and have been able to appreciate their grandfather, which I think is wonderful.
My fellow Americans, I once asked you for your prayers, and now I give you mine. May God guide this wonderful country, its people, and those they have chosen to lead them.
May our third century be illuminated by liberty and blessed with brotherhood, so that we, in all who come after us, may be the humble servants of thy peace. Amen. Good night. God bless you.